Thank you very much. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you to Liz Malley for moderating, and to Professor Imamura and other colleagues, and to all of you for joining today. As Sebastian just mentioned, I've been involved with this Japan Disasters Archive from its founding, and been working in partnership with Tohoku University from from the beginning of the archive project. So let me um, start out. I should say that some of what I'm presenting today, the first portion, overlaps with a presentation I made on March 11th or March 12th at Tohoku in another context. So hopefully there aren't too many of you here today who were there at that point, but I am adding some material on the research collaboration that I'm now involved in with actually Sebastian, the moderator today, as well as other colleagues at Tohoku University I'll mention in a few moments. My focus, like that of Eddie Bernard, and I should say that was a utterly fascinating presentation. I learned so much. The fact that I learned so much reflects that I'm coming to the issue of learning lessons from the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami from a rather different distance, in the sense that not so much the focus on the immediate survival of the tsunami, which is certainly the paramount issue in thinking about learning lessons, but more general lessons about aftermaths, about recovery, about rebuilding better, and about what people elsewhere in the world who may not even be threatened by tsunami, but other types of disaster, might learn. So that will be the sense in which I'll be talking today about learning from the disaster. So my presentation will be divided into these four sections. Introductory remarks, I'm partway through those already. And then lessons. Briefly, I'll talk about the lessons that scholars and researchers in fields such as anthropology or political science have been drawing, at least in Western language or English language work. And then I'll talk some about our own disaster digital archive. Well, I'll introduce that in the introductory remarks and talk about ways in which we hope, and we think already, this archive can be of use for teachers and students in classes around the world. The material in our archive is fundamentally in Japanese and English, with modest amounts in very modest amounts in other languages. And then finally, the new part, I'll be talking about a research project I'm engaged in now with colleagues in Tohoku University and one colleague at Princeton, to look at lessons that might be taken away from our archive and from the disaster region by ordinary citizens, including tourists and visitors. So just to briefly say a little bit more about my own involvement, I'm a latecomer to the study of tsunami and disaster. So in that sense, very different from Professor Bernard. I was shamefully unaware of and gave embarrassing little attention to Japan's history of disaster in general, tsunami, earthquake in particular, in my own scholarly work. Even the textbook I wrote only after March 11th, the textbook came out about a decade before that, focusing on Japan's modern history. It was only after the March 11th disaster that I looked at it again and realized how little attention I had paid to the long and difficult history, although valuable lessons learned history in Japan of dealing with disasters, in particular earthquake-related and tsunami-related disasters. So when March 11th to 2011 disaster happened, at Harvard, we engaged in various activities of fundraising and awareness raising. And here a student organization called Harvard for Japan was formed immediately. And you see a couple of the students there in the slide on the left, and they played a tremendously valuable role in mobilizing the local community. And this happened in communities all around the United States and all around the world to give support. And then also events such as the one shown on the right to discuss what had happened, what was happening. But at the same time, those of us involved in Japanese studies at Harvard, both faculty, grad students, undergraduates, and staff, decided we wanted to do and ought to do something of a longer lasting nature to contribute to remembering and learning from this disaster. And what we hit upon, because it was possible to do it from a distance to some extent, was building a digital archive. This is not precisely a database because we haven't organized the materials in a way that they can be rigorously analyzed the way a database would be. It's more like a library or an archive of born digital materials of all sorts that relate to the disaster. And up on the upper right-hand side, there's a screenshot of the current newly released platform for our archive. And I should say that we started out by calling it the Great East Japan Earthquake and Tsunami Disaster Archive. And then after a few years, we renamed it generically Japan Disasters Archive, deciding that we would try to incorporate information from other disasters that had already happened by the time we made that decision, such as the earthquake in Kumamoto, and others in the past that we knew about, although we haven't made that much progress on that yet, such as the Kobe earthquake, or even going back before World War II to the Kanto Daishinsai, but also disasters that are yet to occur. There are many archives, digital-based digital archives of this disaster and of many other disasters. I think that there are two particular features of our project that are notable. One is its networked structure, and this is what the diagram on the lower right of the screen points to. It's the fact that what we're doing is essentially leaning on the work of our friends and colleagues, mostly in Japan, except for this. And I'm sorry, actually, I should have used the English language version of this diagram for this group today. I'm sorry, I slipped up on that. But this organization here, the Internet Archive, is based in San Francisco, but all the others are based in Japan. And each one, the National Diet Library, the Internet Archive Collection, the NHK Greater East Japan Disaster Archive, the Tohoku University Michinoku Archive, the Kahoku Newspaper Archive, Yahoo Japan's photos, Asahi Shimbun, Asahi Newspaper English language contents. And this is only 7. There are, at the moment, 15 partner archives. So this isn't a complete listing. It's just a conceptual diagram. Each one of these archives can be visited individually by people. What we've done is, through the magic of the software called API, given users simultaneous access searching across all of these archives. It's a little bit like what Expedia does or other travel-based websites do when they let you search the airplane schedules across all different airlines, and they use a similar mechanism. And so it's nothing that unprecedented, but it required, in this case, building trust among partners who were willing to allow our users to access seamlessly, as if they're going to one place for their data across all these different archives. So the network character is one key point. A second key point is that we made it participatory by design. And let me say a bit about what I mean by participatory. First of all, any user can contribute information. If you're somebody who has taken photographs relevant to the March 11th disaster or another disaster, you can upload them, put in keywords for tags, geolocation, a descriptive field. Our curation staff will check to make sure it's appropriate, but we have found almost zero inappropriate, close to zero inappropriate submissions. And these can be websites that you find that are of interest that we will preserve in the partnership with Internet Archive. They could be videos, they can be photographs, as I mentioned, they can be PDFs, they can be documents. And we've had a number of our users become creators of the archive or participate in building the collection, building the archive collection. So that's one way that the archive is participatory. But the other way that I will come back to later, because it's the key, I think, to the learning theme, is the collection feature. And what I mean by that is, and here I've put a square around it. You can see this on the landing page of our archive. It's possible for any user, either privately for their own personal use, in a small group, say for a classroom, for a course, a group of friends or colleagues, or making it public to the world, to go into the archive with a particular theme in mind, with a particular location in mind, maybe with a particular theme that unfolded in a particular location, and discover materials related to your chosen theme, and then pull them into a collection. So it's a mini archive, it's a mini collection within the larger archive, and you can annotate it, you can build it into a presentation by giving topic slides and descriptor slides interspersed with the items themselves. And this has turned out to be very popular among users, both more in learning and teaching environments than in research environments, I think. And it's something that we're hoping to really encourage, including those of you today going forward who might want to make use of this function. It's also possible, if you have your theme in mind and you build a collection in our archive, to add materials to the collection that you don't find. Our archive does not have every existing item in it that is relevant, of course. It only has what we've collected. It's over 1 million items, but it's still not nearly all the relevant digital materials. So in the process of building a collection, I would say somewhere between 30 to 60% of the materials a collection builder might put into their collection will come from outside our archive. And then it's not only put into the collection, but then our curation staff, if it's relevant, will put it into the archive itself. And then, as I said, the user has the discretion to keep that as a private collection or make it public to other visitors to the archive. And at present, we have something like 600 collections. The first couple hundred were built by our staff for the most part as a kind of example to stimulate others to get involved. But more recently, the collections have been built by users. So that's an overview of the Japan Disasters Archive and ways in which I think its functions are relevant to this group today and to the theme of this symposium. Let me say briefly something about lessons that scholars and researchers on Japan, more broadly than researchers on disaster, have learned from the disaster, and also in sociology as well as anthropology and political science. And just one of the most important early books was by Richard Samuels, a professor in the political science department at MIT. Remarkably, he produced this book within a little over a year and a half after the disaster in late 2012, and it looks at several specific realms of policy, including local government cooperation and response, the involvement of the self-defense forces, and a couple other issues, and a really valuable, somewhat pessimistic argument to the effect that not as much has changed, not simply in relation to disaster response, but in politics and society, as one might have expected in the wake of such an awful event. Daniel Aldrich, a political scientist also at Northeastern University, also in Boston, has written a number of articles in this very fine book, Black Wave, talking about how social networks are crucial. His question is how to explain the relative resilience and survival. I should say that Eddie Bernard's presentation made a point that I also make, which is that Japan is a remarkably well-prepared place, and so in responding to such a disaster, and the tragic loss of life was numerous and indeed tragic. But at 3% roughly of the people who were in the inundated zones becoming losing their lives, it was actually a remarkably effective response. And one of Aldrich's questions is, how could such a strong response happen? Not simply because of disaster preparation, but other elements in the social fabric of Japan. And then anthropologists have been doing valuable work, food safety issue. The Fukushima issue, of course, is another layer beyond disaster and tsunami that's crucially important, and in global terms probably draws the most interest among observers, students, researchers. So this book by Nicholas Cisterna on food safety after Fukushima is an important work. Another by an anthropologist looking at named Andrew Littlejohn. This is work in progress, articles so far, and I think a book in the offing, looking at not only sentiment against seawalls, but other aspects of local communities and their responses to the disaster. And this relates to the question that Eddie Bernard raised in terms of learning lessons, which is the question of trust in authorities, how to build trust in the practices and policies of authorities when so many of them manifestly failed in 2011, how to rebuild trust going forward. And how to understand what might seem like irrational resistance, but might have a logic of its own, such as the negative attitude towards seawalls. And then other scholars, including the woman Michaela Kelly, noted in this event that took place this past winter at Harvard, have looked at the impact of the disaster on women's social networks, on decisions to have families. There's been important work on mental health issues as well. So a wide range, not only of political science work, but anthropological and sociological work has been done. I'm just giving you a few examples that I happen to know of personally or directly, but there are many, many more. And of course, and that's in the Anglophone world. And of course, in Japan, there has been important work, important research led notably by Iridis, our host and sponsor today. And this is a slide taken from some of the Iridis production. But since the people who've done that work are here today to talk to you, I'm not going to go into detail, except to say that it's been critically important, and we're very fortunate to be able to have the Iridis Institute in general, the Michinoku Project in particular, as our partner. I want to now talk about lessons for teachers and students, or lessons for students that might be conveyed by teachers, with examples first of some two Japanese collections, and talk a bit about the context for their preparation, and then some English language collections. And especially with the latter, to make the point that it's possible to learn lessons that go far afield and well beyond the specifics of the Japan tsunami and earthquake and tsunami of 2011. So these are two collections that were prepared by school teachers, in one case working together with high school students at a workshop that we sponsored, that is, we being Harvard Japan Disaster Archive faculty and staff, together with Tohoku University, Iridis Institute, and also Miyagi Educational University, where we brought together right before the pandemic set in, at the very end of February in 2020, you can see the date here, a group of teachers in an outreach workshop to encourage them to bring the archive into the classroom. And there were, at least as I viewed it, I mean, I was running the workshop or helping to run it, not taking part, so this may or may not be shared by the participants, but I think it was shared, a great enthusiasm for the potential and to work with students. In some cases at lower grade levels, I think the teachers would curate already a collection of items from within the archive and ask the students to focus on those and read and talk about them. And at other more advanced levels, high school and college, I think setting the students loose to define their own topics in consultation with the teachers, I'm sure, and then have them bring the materials into the archive. It's the equivalent of writing a research paper. And you can see that one of the topics, there were several of the participants who thought this would be important to bring into the classroom, is using our archive, which has lots of tweets that contain false rumors. Use the archive to bring those items out into a collection and analyze them and provide a spark to or a catalyst to discuss and think about how information circulates for good and sometimes for not so good in the course of a disaster such as March 11th. And I should say that when we were first collecting tweets, some people raised the question of whether it was appropriate to incorporate, without filtering, an entire body of tweets connected to certain hashtags without inspecting and kicking out those, not filtering out those tweets that might have had wrong information. And our thinking at the time, we didn't really have the reason fully thought out, was that it's better to have information, good or bad, not to try to mislead people, but so that both scholars and students in the future can look at that and think about the how and why of the circulation of information. On the right-hand side, another collection was built by a teacher who wanted to bring it into her classroom, um, looking at the ways in which, through items in our archive, you can look at disaster education and preparation in elementary schools. So these are just a couple of the collections that Japanese teachers, mostly in social studies classes, shakaika, but also other curricular realms, including science, were interested in. And then we've done similar outreach workshops with teachers in the United States who have then taken some of them into their own classrooms. And this um, on the left. So yes, there were, when I pulled this slide off, which was actually a few months ago, there were 613 collections in the archive, discrete collections done by sometimes individual students and by many others. So here we have a teacher who joined our workshop, and then he went back to his own classroom in Texas, and he was teaching environmental science. And so he set his students to the task of coming up with a topic of interest and searching through the archive and pulling out items relevant to their topic, and then making that the basis for a report to the class or a research paper. I don't know exactly what outcome he used, but this was in his class after our workshop, and you can see some of the topics. Oh, I'm sorry, this was not the Texas-based group. This there was a teacher in Texas who did a very similar thing, but these collections were done by students at a high school, St. Joseph's High School in Boston, Massachusetts, in an environmental science class. And one student looked at shelters, another looked at environmental, about pets. The point that Eddie Bernard said that he felt it was a little silly, but I would say no, it's important. I mean, and I know that Eddie meant it was, his point was, Professor Bernard's point was, it's actually might seem unimportant, but it's very important. Pets are very important to people. And this was not so much about, this collection, not so much about pets immediately after the disaster, but in the long run, how pets can help people. Another student looked at shelters, effects on the ocean, mental health, and so on. And this student on the right did a very nice collection on food security. So that gives you some sense of the lessons in classrooms, both in Japan and the United States, that can be, and to some extent already are being taught using the archive. I want to end by talking about lessons for citizens and visitors. In the last, I think I have about 10 minutes, so I might not take the entire time. Um, a project that I'm engaged in with my colleagues at Tohoku University, Iridis, as well as one at Princeton. At Tohoku University, Julia Gerster, Sebastian Beret, the moderator today, Professor Ryo Morimoto at Princeton, and Professor Shibayama also at Tohoku University, and myself. And this is a project supported by the Japanese government through Iridis that we're in the early stages of. And so I want to give you a brief description of what we're doing and what very preliminary results we're reaching. One of the features of the Japan Disaster Archive I didn't mention so far is that about half of the items, maybe it's more like 2/3, about 800,000 of the individual items in the archive are geolocated. They have lat-long coordinates, so they can be put on a map. I have to say that right now in the launching of our new platform, this is embarrassing to have to admit, the map is not functioning properly. We hope to have it back up and running properly by next week. So everything I'm about to tell you now, please don't try it today, because you'll only be frustrated and you'll think that the archive is no good. Right now, the map is not very good, but it will be back to normal fairly soon, I believe. So because 2/3 or so, about 800,000 of the items in the disaster are geolocated and they can be displayed on a map, the question, our research question is, in a most general way, is what value, what use are geolocated materials to enhance local understanding of the disaster, especially when you can also locate yourself. That is, as you know, mobile phones these days, iPads, also desktop computers, or laptops, but they're hard to carry around. All will give your own geolocation on a map together with other items, right? This is a common knowledge element of the world we live in, the technological world that many people in the world at least live in. So what's the potential for geolocated digital materials to enhance local understanding of the disaster? And in particular, what's the potential for these materials to enhance the experience of a visitor who might be going to a disaster memorial or museum? So-called Densho Shisetsu is the Japanese word. And here on the right-hand side on the screen, you can see the so-called Densho Road, or the Disaster Transmission Road, which is a collection of publicly recognized disaster sites, memorials and museums along the Tohoku coast. And each one has its own curation. Some of them are monuments with descriptors erected in signposts. Others are museums with fuller and richer exhibits. So they're arranged. And one question we had was, okay, if a visitor is in the vicinity of such a site and looks at the map in the Japan Disaster Archive, will they learn anything different than what's being officially presented at that site? Can the geolocation aspect of our archive enhance the experience of visiting these actual places, not digital places? So these are our questions. What we've done so far is, this past winter, conducted an initial survey. We were limited by the pandemic in how many people we could get to join. We were also limited by the people's concern about moving around as freely as they would had there not been a pandemic going on and escalating in Japan at the time we were doing the survey. Nonetheless, we had 50 volunteers who participated, and they filled out a fairly detailed questionnaire, each of them. They took a mobile device with them and either and they use the JDA map with geolocation to either explore materials at a museum or a memorial site, or to explore materials just nearby where they happen to live or be, which might not be a particularly marked site. And both uses we thought were important. Just as an example of how this might work, I couldn't produce myself a screenshot with my own geolocation in Tohoku because the geolocation will only go to where you're actually at. So here, and this is actually where I am not at this moment, but it's where I often hang out, my office in Harvard Square on the Harvard campus. There's a little button ordinarily when the map is working properly. You press this button, or you click on this button, and then the blue dot will appear. And you can then see these are items in our archive. When the archive is zoomed out and there's more than 250 items, they appear as a heat map to give you a sense of the intensity of materials. Once you've zoomed into a point with here, the plus and minus for zooming, there's 136 items. In some places, there's multiple items. And you can click on them and you can see what there is. And what is in the archive, for instance, right next door to my office is a poster and a website concerning various relief and support projects generated at Harvard, although carried out in Japan. But if you were in Japan, for instance, and you took the map and you clicked on this and this is in Urayasu, then you would see, and you could see, let's say you lived in Urayasu, which is very near Tokyo, but was hit by a very dramatic and awful phenomenon of liquefaction where the ground sunk. Landfill ground, you could find out various things about what happened or during or after the disaster in that area. So these would be examples of using the JDA map with geolocation to explore materials nearby where people are. So just some preliminary results to wrap up. The 50 or so surveyors found that in particular images and tweets and videos, but also to a surprising extent, newspaper articles and geolocated websites were all seen as valuable items by different users. Different people found different things of interest. This was very pleasing to us. We asked the question, did your consciousness of or awareness of disaster prevention increase by using the Japan Disaster Archives? That's this question here in the pie chart. This is all in Japanese, but very simply, yes is blue and no is red. The largest number said, yes, it was my awareness of disaster prevention or my understanding and interest increased by using the archive. And we were pleased with that, especially since this was a somewhat self-selected group of people who were already interested in the disaster. So one might think they would already have a fairly high consciousness, not only of disasters, but the importance of disaster prevention. Many users told us that they learned something new about the disaster in general from using the archive, which was pleasing. But of course, that would be the case whether or not you did searching on the map, but also whether you just did topic searching through a list of items. But also many told us that they learned something new about their own location, even if their own location wasn't a disaster memorial site or museum, but just where they happened to be, which is in many cases where they happened to be on March 11th. And even though in many cases it was a familiar spot, by visiting the map and seeing the items around themselves that are in the archive, they were able to refresh their memory or learn something new. So we were gratified by that. What we were disappointed in, and it gives us a focus going forward, is relatively few of the users, and most of them did go to a museum or to a memorial site. Few of them said they learned something new about that place, or that they learned something that wasn't already explained by the museum. Well, in a way, bravo for the museum. You would think that they would effectively present their material, but we were hoping there might be a different twist or an angle. And that leads us to think that we have the need to create curated collections using ourselves, or ask the people, if they're interested, who have knowledge of these sites, to create curated collections, which then would already prepackage information about that location. So this is an issue for our future work. I think I've run out of time. I've come to the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for your attention.